in a lot of classes we do, it seems that trying to figure out how to tie the bowline is actually a little more difficult than we lead people on to believe. And I'm going to try to dumb this down and kind of explain the intricacies of the bowline knot here. So first and foremost, we need the object that we're going to tie around, or if it's just a loop in space, that's fine, but you need some sort of perspective here. So we're going to use this as an object that we tie around. Or screw, this could be a little bridle or whatever, but I tied it, or I've wrapped it around, and now I need to create a loop, and that little loop is going to be what I actually use to tie my bowline knot with. And so first off, if you look at the object and the tail and where your knot's going to be tied, if you make a loop and that loop is not within the footprint of your material that you're encapsulating, that's your first sign that you need to correct that. So it doesn't matter which way you route this. If this loop is out here, you're not going to get it. So when you tie this, first you want to make sure that our loop is on the inside of the bigger tree, right? Okay, now how do we tie this? So this is where everyone gets hung up. And what no one ever really told me was that the direction of where you feed this, whether you're coming in from the bottom or the top, it's completely dependent on the way that you routed this loop from the standing end as it goes to the running end. You can think of this as a track. So if you pan the camera down to this level down here, and you can see that the standing end is underneath and the loop travels on top of it on the running end as it comes around. And that's important because that's based on that routing is going to dictate whether I have a bowline or not. So here the standing end is underneath and the loop routes around the top. Therefore, I must feed this tail from the bottom up. If I feed this from the top down, I don't have a bowline. It's just not going to work out for me. As you can see, that's not a bowline, it's just a bunch of twists. Okay, so let's do this one more time, figure this out. So I make a loop, the loop is inside, and standing in is underneath as the loop travels on top. Now I must feed this tail from the bottom, and then I need to grab this in some way and bring it into the loop. And this is the difference between an inside bowline, where the tails finish on the inside of your big loop, or outside. And from here, it doesn't matter where I put this tail, left or right of the standing end, I'm still gonna get a bowline, but it'll mean outside or inside. So let's slow this down. I know I have to feed this up from the bottom as long as my track went that way. If I take this tail and go on the back side and grab it, and you can just see that the tail ends on the inside. It's an inside bowline, and vice versa. If this tail that I feed up through the loop and I go in front and then bring it through, that's an outside bowline. We like outside bowlines for our long tail bowlines for litter packaging, because this long tail doesn't interfere with like the gain, or what we call the gain in here. It keeps this ring knot or this yoke of like a bridle clean. So that's why we like long tail bowlines with the tail on the outside, tied with an outside bowline. You just have to revert to muscle memory to figure out what is going to work for you. So for me personally, every time I go standing in on the bottom and I travel the loop, the running end crosses over on the top of it. Every time I tie this, that's what I do. But if my loop is reversed, so that, let's see, so you can see now that my standing end is on top and I route the running end underneath, that changes the dynamic of the tail where I feed it. So now feeding this tail from the bottom up no longer applies. I'm not going to get my bowline. I have to go top down in order to actually achieve a bowline knot. I can go inside or outside, inside, doesn't really matter. And I grab, and that gives me a bowline knot, but the view is a little bit different. So personally for me, I like always having my standing end going underneath, and I route my running end on top of it. Every time for me, I know I'll always get it right if I do that and I feed the tail through the bottom. The snap or the flip method, That's just a way of tying it. It's just another way. This standard way, you can actually see the knot begin to take shape as you tie it. So when people are learning how to do this, this is intuitive. It makes sense because you can see it take shape. The snap or the flip method is like a gee whiz way of doing it, and it's a lot faster, but you should learn the basics first. And so the snap method, I start the same way, except this time, after I've routed my rope around the tree and then made my loop, I'm going to take the standing end bight and feed it through. And what this is, and I'm going to make this nice and tight so you can see it. This is a slip knot. It's like a hitch, right? I hold this and I landmark it. I want to keep everything tight in my hand when I tie this. And now I can feed up or down, doesn't matter. If I feed up, that's an inside bowline. And if I feed from the top down, that's an outside bowline. I only know this because I've done this so many times that it's muscle memory is what's going to get you comfortable with doing this. So let's go inside bowline. So up. I want to, once I route this tail through my slip knot, I want to grab the tail and I want to grab where that tail came from into a bight. So you can see that. I want to grab and hold on to this. With my other hand, I want to grab and pull on the standing end until the knot starts to flip, and sometimes you have to give a finger push to get that to pop. So it snaps or flips and reverses, and then you can see that it's a bowline. If this is how I keep it and I don't do anything else, I'm gonna choke up on my yoke. And this is not a long tail. I have to tie this off with a backup knot. Or I could Yosemite retrace finish this. And Yosemite retracing is just a way to finish this tail so that it travels out the standing end, the path of the standing end. And so again, just like muscle memory, it takes practice. So you have to figure out, how do I get this tail to parallel? What strand do I parallel to get it to come out that standing end? So there's two options really. You can take the tail this way, or you can take the tail around this way. So let's see, if I take the tail around this way and I follow that knot down, well, that's the right answer right there. I know that for a fact. So I wrap around and I parallel what's going to be that standing end right here. And as I look on the back side, I'm paralleling the standing end, and I want to feed this tail through that slot. A lot of times people are fighting that slot. All you have to do is make a purchase point, create a little gap just with your thumb, just choke up on that yoke and get yourself some space so that you can feed the tail through. And once you feed the tail through, close it back up. That's a Yosemite retrace finish. And you're like thinking, so what? Who cares? Well, by itself, just like this, it doesn't need a backup or a stopper knot, so I don't have to put like a overhand or double overhand stopper knot here. I can just leave this as is. But to quote Reed Thorne, a bowline tied without a forward-facing loop is useless. And that's a generality, and what he was emphasizing was that why not tie your bowline knot to give you some options for anchoring and tying other things into? And that's what the Yosemite finish does for us. So what this is, I start by tying a bowline with a bight. So what that means is I have I tie it with a bight. So I treat the tail as if it were a bight. So I grab a bight and I feed the bight through. And I want enough bight so that I can actually, one, complete the knot, but then retrace this. So I want a big bight here, relatively big bight. And I have to go inside. If I go outside, I can't do a Yosemite retrace. It won't work. So that's why it has to be inside. So now I've tied my bowline knot with a bight. I've checked it. It is a bowline. And now I do the retrace by taking the entire bight and I'm gonna give myself a little bit more here. Taking the entire bight and going around and then down. And I want to give myself a little bit of gap so I can feed my bight through down here. And this bight is going to be very tight right in there. This is ultra low gain because when I tighten up on all this, and I need to leave myself a little more tail there, I create this loop, and that's super low, small loop, but it'll still work. You can put a carabiner in here and you can do a lot of things with this now. Another video I talked about non-working 3-to-1 back ties, but now like if I can't get like a wrap and pull anchor with webbing and a carabiner and then do a figure 8 to clip in to do a non-working 3-to-1 back tie, I can just do a bowline around a big object and then have this forward-facing loop clip in And now I have the strand and the beaner, and I make my circle. This strand is basically like your figure 8 clipped into the beaner already. So for my non-working 3-to-1s, what I can do is make my circle. I've made my circle. This represents a non-working 3-to-1 with a change of direction, and then I can drag this out and make my pre-tension back tie, just doing a bowline with a bight and a forward-facing loop via Yosemite retrace finish. So that was with a bight. So I think we can all agree that if I take a bight and I tie a figure of 8 knot, that is a figure 8 on a bight, because I've taken a bight and I've tied a figure 8 on it. So a figure 8 on a bight. I think we can all agree on that. What we can't agree on is what a bowline on a bight is. And unfortunately, we're all still living in the past with Ashley's Book of Knots, and I just don't agree with it. For me, it doesn't make any sense that they call it a double bowline, and I don't see it that way. What I see is I take a bight, I take this bight and I tie a bowline, hence bowline on a bight. So I take a bight, I tie my bowline on the bight, bring it back, bowline on a bight. And again, some people call this a double bowline. I don't call this a double bowline. I call it a bowline on a bight. And again, I do a Yosemite retrace finish. I pop that bottom loop out there to give myself purchase to feed that bight through. This is a huge gain here. Now what I have is I have 2 tails coming out the backside plus a loop, and now I can do 2 non-working 3-to-1s if I want, going to different places. Or I could use, if this was the midpoint of my rope bag, I could use each one of these tails as a static rappel line if I wanted to. So you can do a lot of things with the bowline. So that was the bowline on a bight with a forward-facing loop via Yosemite retrace finish. Okay, let's back out of this. So we kind of agreed that a figure 8 on a bight is kind of like a bowline on a bight. And if you guys are ever familiar with the rabbit ears or bunny ears figure 8, let's see what we're doing when we do a bunny ears figure 8. So when we do this, before we actually complete our figure 8, a normal figure 8 and a bight, I take this and push it all through, but I'm just gonna take that bight and take this bight over and complete my rabbit ears figure 8. So with that logic, or with that kind of popping over, taking that bight and popping over action, for me it seems more appropriate if I did the bowline equivalent. This is a double bowline as opposed to a double figure 8. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna start by tying an overhand on a bight. Overhand on a bight, just like that. Just like with our double figure 8, we kind of had some sort of action where we had to pull more bights through something. And so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna take this bight and I'm gonna fold over the bridge or the leading edge of this overhand. I'm gonna fold this over, pin that, and then I'm gonna start pulling the rest out of that knot. And as you see, when this thing pops over, when I do that, I would say that that's like your bunny ears bowline or a double bowline. So Ashley says that this is a bowline on a bight. I would disagree, but does it really matter? No. I could call this a chingazo as long as everybody knows what we're talking about. So that's just my 2 cents on bowlines. Okay, let's go 2-point anchors. I'm talking about bowlines. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna still use this here, and then I'm gonna use a tree over here. And I'm gonna do the Portuguese bowline. So here we go. All right, Tom, so let's zoom out and get like basically a shot of me doing this. It's a 2-point anchor, 2-point bowline. I don't ever want to attempt to do a Portuguese bowline on 3 anchor points or more, because it gets very difficult to keep track of where things are. It's difficult enough to get the 2-point Portuguese bowline right. So I need enough to bring the equalizing point down to something like this. And I need I need enough tail so I can tie it with a bight and do the whole Yosemite retrace. So I have all this coming in at me. I'm gonna keep the tail kind of up here so that it's out of the way, and I still want to tie just like a normal bowline. I have my little loop. I need to bring this equalizing section, and I need to lay it flat on top of that loop, just like that. And now I can come in with my bight, bring it up, and again, if I want to have that forward-facing loop, what that forward-facing loop means is Yosemite retrace. So I can only Yosemite retrace if I have an inside bowline. So here's my inside bowline with a bight, but now I've done it Portuguese style, and I cinch it down and I give myself a sanity check and make sure that this is in fact a bowline right here, and it is. So where people get hung up here is when they do the Yosemite retrace. If you took this bight and did a retrace around just that section and left the equalizing section out, it's going to mess your system up, and it's kind of dangerous. So when you do this, you have to make sure that you wrap around everything you've got, all of it. Just be on the safe side, wrap around everything. Do the same thing, give yourself some purchase, and then feed it through. Okay, and now you can adjust left and right. And you can see that it's twisted, and it's twisted, right? That's not a big deal. If you get comfortable with this and you've got this dialed, consider cleaning it up, refining your practice a little bit. So I'm gonna tie the Portuguese bowline again, but this time I'm gonna tie it so that I don't have these crossing strands right here. I'm gonna make it really super clean and nice. The last time I tied this, I started on the outside and continued on, but now I'm gonna start on the inside and then continue on. Does this tail cross underneath or on top? Well, you can figure this out real quick by simulating tying your Portuguese bowline and having this going somewhere else. You can see that as you tie it, like you see this section is completely straight. So you know that going on top is the way to go. So it's inside out, and I need a lot of rope, and then I'm gonna go outside in. So instead of routing this way, I'm gonna go outside in and bring it this way. And I need a lot more rope. A lot more rope. Because I want more tail, and that's probably okay. All right. So same thing as before. Now we can zoom in on this. Okay, Portuguese bowline. I have my bight. I'm gonna tie it like normal with a bight. Bring that, make that bight so I can manage it. There we go. Inside, not outside. Take a pause here, do a sanity check, make sure that you actually have a bowline, and then do your Yosemite retrace around all the strands, everything you've got, the entire thing. And then pop those 2 strands on the bottom, and then feed it in. Now you have it. Now look at the strands coming back to your anchors. There are no twists anywhere. So that's inside out, outside in method of tying a Portuguese bowline. This has its share of pros and cons, and I think I've covered that in another video about whether this is load sharing or load distributing under load. So watch that video, and I go into more depth in explaining where I would use this, when I would use it, and when I would have second thoughts about using it, etc., etc., etc. So one last thing about the bowline, I'm gonna kind of correlate this to like a sheet bend or a Beckett bend. A bowline is a Beckett bend. So I'm gonna start by showing you just how identical these knots really are. All right, here we go. Here's a bowline. And let's say that my loop is this rock, or the object is the rock. Okay, so I would normally finish tying it with this tail. I'm gonna leave this tail here, and I'm gonna pretend for a second that this is actually the tail that's gonna continue on. It's another rope, right? So I'm gonna finish tying my bowline, and I'm just gonna do a simple bowline just to show you like the Beckett bowline relationship. So if we tape this piece right here together, if we tape that together, that's a bowline, right? If we take scissors, cut that, and now we've cut our loop, let's take a look at the knot. And so we flip this over, what do we have here? Well, we have a bight right there, and we have what appears to be Well, that looks like a, oh yeah, here we go. That looks like a sheet bend or a becket bend. So look at the bight and look at how this rope is routed up and through. And just to drive the point home, let's back out all this, keep my bight in my hand, and tie a becket or a sheet bend. I go up, wrap around the thumb as a reference point, and back out. It's identical